Few directors are as synonymous with horror as John Carpenter. From Halloween to The Thing to Prince of Darkness and so much more, there's a reason why he's been nicknamed the Master of Horror when he came to popularity in a time when horror was booming and competition for that label was steep. But for every film that managed to hit the big screen, there are dozens more that Carpenter almost made. From rejected scripts to studio drama to the shifts in Carpenter's fortunes at the box office, there are many different reasons why the director was unable to bring so many different promising films to life. And while I highlighted many of these with brief descriptions in a video I made a few years ago, the one I most want to see is Carpenter's nearly made remake of Universal Pictures' Creature from the Black Lagoon. Personally, it seems like a dream come true. My favorite Universal monster and my favorite director coming together in a modern film when Carpenter was still pumping out great movies. So what went wrong? It seems like an undeniable combination. And what can the finished script for this movie tell us about what John Carpenter's vision for the Creature from the Black Lagoon would have been? Come with me as we travel to John Carpenter's unmade Creature from the Black Lagoon, a lost Universal classic in the making. The story of The Creature from the Black Lagoon begins all the way back in 1941, when Universal producer William Allen was told the story of a half-man, half-fish monster myth from the Amazon River from cinematographer Gabriel Figueroa. The story sparked an idea in Allen's mind, but it wasn't until 1952 that Allen chose to pursue it, with Maurice Zimm creating a treatment for a story titled The Sea Monster that was turned into a script by Harry Essex and Arthur Ross titled Black Lagoon, with Jack Arnold hired on to direct. From there, as you probably already know, the film would go on to be released in 1954, becoming an immediate success and the final late addition to the classic canon of Universal monsters. The studio would quickly make two more movies, Revenge of the Creature in 1955 and The Creature Walks Among Us in 1956. In just a few years, the Gill Man was solidified as a classic monster, a creature towing the line between the more traditional tragic gothic characters of Universal's heyday and the new wave of atomic monsters sparked by Cold War fears in the 1950s. But because the creature was an original creation for Universal by Millicent Patrick, instead of something based on public domain material or cultural myths like Dracula, Frankenstein, or the Wolfman, other studios couldn't simply make their own creature film due to Universal owning the character. And yet, the Gill Man's popularity grew and grew through pop culture, homages, rip-offs, and art that placed him alongside some of the biggest icons in horror. Really, the closest that we ever got to a new creature movie for decades was Fred Decker's The Monster Squad in 1987, with Stan Winston and Winston Studios making new versions of the classic monsters that were just different enough to avoid being sued. As for the Gill Man, this version's more aggressive, detailed, piranha-inspired take was wonderful. It just didn't spawn any more movies. Over the decades, Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, and The Wolfman would all be given new life on film from many different studios that were able to cash in on their public domain leniency while using Universal's legacy for clout. Except for The Creature. But it wasn't for lack of Universal trying. John Landis, famous for comedies like Animal House, horror like American Werewolf in London, and causing the deaths of an adult and two children, tried to remake Creature for a large chunk of the 80s, with his insistence on the movie being in 3D being a major stumbling block. Specifically, Landis hired writer Nigel Neal, famous for creating the Quatermass stories, to write the script and hopefully having Jack Arnold return to direct. After that project died, Carpenter entered the picture at the beginning of the 90s. If you're familiar with Carpenter, you probably know the many ups and downs his career took throughout the 80s. Early independent successes like Halloween, The Fog, and Escape from New York led to the director making the big-budget remake of The Thing for Universal in 1982, and while it's beloved now, it critically and commercially failed at the time. That immediately caused Carpenter to lose favor at Universal, with the studio kicking him out of their production of Firestarter after initially hiring him. And for the next decade, Carpenter survived on for-hire films and micro-budget movies. A lot of those movies are amazing, and that's because Carpenter made the most of it, but he was really limited coming off the back of The Thing's failure. By the beginning of the 90s, Carpenter's career was again on an upswing, with the director helming Memoirs of an Invisible Man for Studio Canal and Warner Brothers, and in the time between its production and release, the movie's $40 million budget and stars like Chevy Chase and Daryl Hannah made Carpenter attractive to big studios again. Enter Universal Studios president Tom Pollock, who courted the director for a return a decade after The Thing debacle. He said, "Look through our library of pictures and see if there's anything you want to make," said Carpenter. The first thought that came to mind was Creature from the Black Lagoon. And while Carpenter often wrote his own scripts, he was open to hiring other writers. One of his most frequent collaborators was Bill Phillips, who wrote Christine for Carpenter, made a draft of Firestarter when the director was attached, and co-wrote El Diablo with John, the TV Western movie based on Carpenter's idea that is essentially the Western he never made. And so, with Universal on board and Carpenter providing his ideas to Phillips for the story he'd like to tell, Phillips wrote his version of Creature from the Black Lagoon, with the finished first draft dated May 8th, 1992, which is the story you are about to experience. Anyway, enough with the backstory, let's get on to the movie. In an homage to the original, Phillips' script opens with the Earth itself forming, connecting our creature to the primordial origins of the planet before quickly moving to Brazil and the Amazon in 1988. Here we follow a small plane piloted by American Richard Conroy and his passenger, the Australian Pete Hazard, reading maps and decked out in cowboy gear. As the opening credits roll, the duo's flight is interrupted by a massive storm that causes them to emergency land, crashing into, who could have guessed, the Black Lagoon. And while the plane is destroyed, both men survive. And it's here where we get our first description of the lagoon, with Phillips' script describing it as strikingly beautiful. Surrounded by dense jungle, it is about 60 yards by 200. Tree branches and vines hang over the dark water. The rain lets up. Fog rises. We hear toucans, howler monkeys, tree frogs. A symphony of noises. The script also makes sure to describe the lagoon as incredibly humid, with anyone in it immediately drenched by their sweat and the moisture in the air, and that the water itself is pitch black at any time of day, making the lagoon and whatever lives within it hidden to the human eye. But this is where we get our first taste of Carpenter and Phillips' biggest additions to the story, as Pete and Richard soon see the tip of a stone covered in hieroglyphics sticking out of the water. Paddling out in their life raft, the two men discover that the stone is the top of a pyramid temple, and are able to remove the stone and stare down into its dark, watery interior. But just before they can investigate further into what is clearly a death trap, a huge, webbed, scaly hand explodes out of the water, grabs Richard's face, pulls him below the surface. With Richard pulled deep into the water, Pete escapes back to the plane to radio for help, only to be confronted by the creature, who we only see in shadow. But before anything can happen, we cut to 5 years later. Yep, that super fast jump into action in the Black Lagoon was a prologue to the story that comes next. It's a little frustrating, but a lot like the original movie, it sets us up with danger and the stakes and the truth that our characters are about to encounter in the adventure that they go on. Now 1993, we are immediately back in the Black Lagoon. This time, however, we follow a massive research ship called the El Dorado II, carrying sophisticated equipment and a helicopter. On board are American ichthyologist Abel Gonzalez, in his 30s, the older Jake Heyman from Long Island, who is best dressed without a friend on board and soon shown to be a dirty old man, the Frenchman Jean-Claude Gaston, who is here to study plants, the Italian Adolfo Palminteri, young African-American Bobby Whitaker, Amazonian Indian with a PhD Hector Ramirez, a botanist, Canadian algae scientist Mary Pearson, and young American woman Siri Thompson, formerly with Greenpeace. However, Siri was kicked out of Greenpeace for spiking trees, a potentially deadly way of stopping loggers, and was picked up by the ship when she escaped from angry locals by diving into the Amazon River. The expedition has clearly only just arrived as they soon find the tip of the pyramid, as well as the plane crash, now thoroughly overgrown by the jungle. Soon, the group opens the top of the pyramid like before and gets in contact with archaeologist Jim Treadwell from USC. However, given that it'll likely be weeks before Treadwell arrives, the group is anxious to explore the underwater pyramid, which seems to be Incan in origin. The pacing of these early pages is a little too stop-start. We have our big adventure, scary prologue, and then we immediately jump into the future only to be already back in the Black Lagoon with a completely different group. And although we're introduced to the members of this research group one by one, we find out that Siri has only just joined this group right before the movie started, and because of that, we get a new introduction to everyone and who they are as soon as we've already met them. The result is that we don't really understand who Siri is as a character for most of the length of this movie. I do get that Phillips was trying to jump us right into the action and avoid the tedious prologue and setup that a lot of movies kind of get bogged down by, and of course this is a first draft and he's just trying to get to the meat of the story, but there's just too much back and forth here, and also we don't understand why the expedition has come to the Black Lagoon, and we never get any set reason. Also, no one involved in this group has ever known anything about the creature before, so there's no motivation there either. Jake is quickly after Siri, getting her alone in her room and implying she'll need to sleep with him to stay on board. The script very quickly has multiple confrontations between the two in a row, with one on the deck of the ship being silently watched by the Gillman, who's actually only referred to as the creature in this script, the camera taking his POV from the surface of the water. Jake is soon boiled down to a single line by Mary: "If it floats, flies, or fucks, Jake wants to possess it." We've quickly established Jake as a threat, but as you'll see, he kinda just disappears from the second half of this script. Our very first trip into the water has Abel and Bobby scuba dive with a camera and sound equipment, which has a live feed to the rest of the crew on board the boat. Underwater, the lagoon is home to pink dolphins, piranha, and the pyramid, with Incan hieroglyphics scrawled across all of it. Inside of the pyramid, Abel finds more hieroglyphics as well as ancient stone furniture, altars, and a goblet. It's a tense scene as the script teases the creature arriving, but instead it's only fish and shadows as Abel takes the goblet back to the group. And soon we have a full-on exploration and testing of the pyramid by our researchers, accompanied by Hector detailing ancient myths of underwater civilizations that have existed for centuries in the Amazon. Further down into the pyramid, we find that the floor is covered in skulls, bones, and the remnants of a dead civilization, while twisting and winding corridors are made out of huge stone blocks that lead to open, dry chambers underwater. And while it's a much larger and more coordinated group exploration, we have our first victim from the group 38 pages in, as Jean-Claude screams off camera and disappears. Siri and Abel search for their colleague and explore the temple, but can't find him. And it's here where we get our first big break in the film as page 42 cuts away to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and a Brazilian government office where we find, shockingly, Pete Hazard, our Australian cowboy from the crash we thought long dead. Pete is working for the government and has a massive scar going from his mouth all the way down his neck, and it's he who receives the distress call from the research group asking for a search party to help find Jean-Claude. But instead of putting together a team, Hazard leaves on his own without telling anyone. Back in the pyramid, Siri ends up exploring a section on her own, and while she's been followed by the creature for a while, it's here where Phillips fully reveals our Gillman as he steps into the light, describing him as half man, half fish. He is huge, powerful. His body is plated, covered with scales, yet his skin is almost translucent, areas of green broken up with mottled colors, silvery around his gills. His hands and feet are webbed, with huge claws on each digit, and his face, a fish mouth, and inside razor-sharp rows of teeth used to rend and tear flesh. And his eyes, alive, not simply blank fish eyes, but more human, glowing with cunning, emotion, intelligence. From here, it's a continued intercutting between scenes of exploring the temple with scenes of Hazard making his way closer and closer, heading upriver in a motorboat and bringing an arsenal with him. It's clear that Pete is half crazed from what he encountered, talks to himself, and hates any animal he sees. Eventually, Hazard reaches the boat, with only Mary on board, and makes some weird come-ons to her. It's odd. Yeah, he's clearly a drunk, horny creep, but you came here to kill a fish dude. Get your head in the game, man. Inside the pyramid, our group finds countless human remains, including the bones of Richard Conroy, our pilot from the prologue, and they bring his body back up to the boat only to find Hazard has joined them and has declared his intention to kill the monster. During a rambling and weird and not all that well written monologue, Hazard reveals a scar going down from his mouth across his chest and all the way down into his pants, and reveals that it was the Yanomami tribe of Native Americans that found him and saved him years ago. Hazard, crazed from his past attack, will either blow up the pyramid with grenades or lead the party in their search for the creature, so, not wanting the ancient temple destroyed, they have Hazard join them. But when Adolfo tries to radio for help, he finds that all communication gear on board has been destroyed, with Hazard the likely suspect. And as we reach the halfway point, our crew is cut off from the outside world and stuck between a monster and the madman who will do anything to kill it. So now that you've gotten some understanding of what this story would have focused on and how it would have changed and also adhered to the classic Universal monster at the center, I think it's important to understand how Carpenter, Phillips, and company were hoping to approach this story in general and what maybe would have been fleshed out more in future drafts. Obviously, this Phillips script is a complete fresh start from the attempts that came before. In the 80s, Carpenter had worked with Neil, an idol of Carpenter's, to write the script for Halloween 3, but Neil apparently hated the film and was miserable to work with. A real don't meet your heroes moment for Carpenter. So unsurprisingly, when Carpenter took over, he wasn't interested in working with Neil again. And beyond setting the film in the modern day, the whole approach to the creature's origin was different, with Carpenter saying, "It would be interesting to combine that with creationist scientists, who are trying to prove that man walked with dinosaurs 10,000 years ago. They try to prove the literal, biblical origin of life, in total contradiction of scientific fact. I would also love to work in a little Lovecraftian feel. I'm thinking of the Shadow over Innsmouth, fish mating with humans. There has been a legend about this manfish, so perhaps there was a race of them, living in the Amazon. Supposedly, there are hidden pyramids in the Amazon, so I want to try to get that in there." So, about those ideas. While there may be later drafts after this first draft, I am not entirely sure how far these drafts actually progressed, given the timeline of how soon this was cancelled by Universal. As is, there are some theories mentioned by characters about humans and fish mating and creating these hybrid monsters millennia ago, and there's also hieroglyphics in the pyramid that symbolize a larger kingdom of creatures that I think could have been really cool if done in the right detail and given enough time on screen to be a sort of a mystery about the larger kingdom and everything that happened, centuries ago before this movie started. But none of that is really expanded upon, so you just kind of have to take some wild guesses about what it all means. Of course, given that this is a remake, there are various little homages to the original throughout. Philip's script draws attention to chainsmoker Jean-Claude carelessly tossing his cigarette into the lagoon. The underwater pyramid, while a new addition, is playing off the creature's underwater cavern that he used as his home. The way the group uses underwater videography, while more advanced, is a big part of the original as well. The script also recreates the underwater ballet of the original, with Siri swimming in the pyramid and unknowingly mirrored by the creature below. To bring the iconic creature into modern film, Carpenter hired special effects master Rick Baker, with designs leaked online years later showing a faithful but less rubbery, more sleek creature. It's a really cool design, recognizably the creature but feeling fresh and much more natural. And with some new abilities that we'll encounter later, it would have been a wonderful showcase for Baker's effects. "We actually did a whole bunch of designs and maquettes," Baker said. "My designs for the creature were kind of like my designs for the Wolfman. It was very much based on a love for the original material, and trying to stay true to that in a lot of ways. I think we had a creature that was updated, but you could still tell where it came from." And much like the original, the creature takes a clear romantic interest in Siri. That's paired with a recurring, lingering sexual threat from the men on board the boat towards Siri. Over the course of the film, Jake, Hazard, Adolfo, and Pete all make moves on Siri, who has to strongly reject them until she eventually develops a romance with Abel. The one other woman on board, Mary, has clearly been through all of this in the previous years, and is now a hardened, closed-off character that confines herself to her lab, but is eventually revealed to be sleeping with Jake. So while it's telling its own story, all the major elements of Jack Arnold's film are here, just not in obvious ways, and for that I really do appreciate this script. It's not giving you a one-to-one story, and it's not giving you too hard of a wink-wink nudge-nudge regarding its homages to the original. It's just trying to be its own thing while still being in line with what people sort of expect from a Creature from the Black Lagoon story, and I think it's a pretty solid start. It just needs some more drafts and some more polish. And that leads us to our much darker, much bloodier second half of the film. We pick back up with almost the entire research party, including Hazard, deep inside the pyramid and searching for Jean-Claude. And finally, thank God, 65 pages in, our group finds a crypt deep within the labyrinth where they see Jean-Claude's corpse. A deep claw slash all the way down his chest and an arm ripped off. I'm not glad he's dead, I'm just saying that the search for an obviously dead guy was taking up way too much of this script. So with Hazard a clear threat and the research group having no authority over him in the country, Adolfo secretly leaves in a raft to get the authorities to arrest him, only for Hazard to immediately shoot him dead as soon as he's left the lagoon. Meanwhile, Siri slowly combs through the last seen footage of Jean-Claude in the pyramid, freezing it and developing the image until they finally see their first picture of the creature. Abel thinks it could be some kind of fish. Hector says that shamans are supposed to shapeshift into creatures to defend their homes from hunters and fishermen. In any case, the new evidence sends the team back into the crypt where they find hundreds of skeletons, hieroglyphics depicting fishmen and their king, and a webbed hand, much like the fossil found at the start of the first film. However, the group is trapped inside when something blocks the exit, leading to a tense scene where the group nearly runs out of air before being rescued, which causes Siri and Abel to form a bond. Unsurprisingly, the fossil discovery sets the group on a mission to discover more, while Hazard is still determined to kill the creature. Breaking this down for a second, by just looking at the script's focus overall, I would say there's a good 30 to 40 pages right in the middle of the script that's just all about the exploration of the pyramid. There's pyramids within pyramids, catacombs, dry underwater chambers, and they lead to further and further sections. There's a crypt and another section behind the crypt, and eventually that leads to this underground lake that's a lot more like the creature's hiding place in the original movie. I just think that there's way too much time spent on this, and there's way too much back and forth. We keep going from the boat into the pyramid, back to the boat, further into the pyramid, back to the boat, and then further and further into the pyramid over and over again, as at first we're looking for Jean-Claude, and then we're just trying to understand more of this pyramid from above ground and underground. In some ways, I think that that could be exciting if it's done right, given enough of a budget, and well-designed sets that are big enough and shot well enough, with a big enough budget for those. As is, I just think it's a little too boring. I don't really find that there's any need in breaking it down for you here in this video because it's sort of the same thing over and over, with the group very slowly making progress and coming back to the same places again and again until they find an underground lake. How that would play on screen really depends on the direction. Obviously, Carpenter was still doing great work at this time. The set design, which could look really cool if they made this detailed and unique, and the budget. A massive portion of this script takes place underwater within huge sets, which would cost a lot of money and need a long shooting schedule to get done. As it is, I'm very tired of this by page 70 of this 120-page script. But this dynamic keeps going on until page 85. Thankfully, after many pages of secretly stalking Siri, we see a new development with the creature as it crawls onto land and flushes all the water out of the pouches in its body. Now his skin begins subtly changing color as he starts to inflate his lungs. A deep, breathy sound hisses from the creature as air rushes into his lungs. His eyes undergo a transformation, the pupils taking on more detail, the flat, shiny fish lens disappearing. Suddenly, he stands erect, dark, and reptilian, yet somehow partly human. He glances around, hurries to the shelter of some rocks. It's a pretty major change to the Gill Man, changing him from the original's ability to sort of be okay on both land and in the water at the same time, although clearly much more comfortable in the water, and turning him into a sort of ambulatory fish like a mud skipper. It also turns the creature into much more of a missing link than ever before, and Phillips adds a few new features, including extending claws and octopus-like ink that it sweats out of its forehead. This all happens as our group attempts to flush out the creature and leads to our first on-screen attack of the film, a whole 86 pages in, as the creature uses its stiletto blade-like claws to slash Bobby across the face, quickly killing him and then escaping. In another plot point taken from the original, Hector and Abel find an unnamed plant they crush into a fine powder that will knock the creature unconscious. And with several members armed with poison-tipped harpoons, the hunt is actually really fast, with the creature shot 3 times and paralyzed, then netted. Of course, Hazard immediately wants to kill the thing, but is coerced to spare its life with a gun to his head. From here, we move into the final act, with the creature now in a half-water-filled cage in Mary's lab, alongside other specimens from the lagoon. And it's here where we see both the creature and Abel's romantic fascination with Siri, with the Gillman clearly angered by the competition. In fact, the creature is so angry that he almost breaks apart the cage before he's drugged again. And while the team decides to head back to civilization, he wakes up fast and tricks Mary into getting too close, slashing her throat and crushing her head against his cage bars. It's brutal, and in his violent escape from the lab, the creature sets a massive fire. But in a move that really illustrates the creature to be a protector of his land, he frees every animal in the lab, throwing fish, turtles, and manatee into the water and letting the monkeys, jaguar, tapir, toucan, and more run free. Not only that, but the creature also destroys all evidence of him on the boat before making a clean getaway back into the water. There's some weird back and forth here because while the ship seems doomed, they put out the fire. And while the creature seems to have escaped as they hunt him, he comes back to the ship. And just as Siri and Abel share their first kiss, the creature knocks out Abel and kidnaps Siri, diving down into the temple with her in his arms. This all leads to a final confrontation in the underground lake as Hazard, Abel, Jake, and Hector, who now know a shortcut to the lake, arrive heavily armed. Below the water, the creature hides with Siri by breathing out huge air bubbles for her to breathe, eventually giving her a life-breathing kiss underwater as Siri seems to stop being afraid of him. Still, the hunt is on, and while Jake is able to shoot him with 2 harpoons, the creature here is incredibly tough, much stronger than the original. Our lead creep is done for as the creature slices off his head with one swipe, leaving his headless, blood-spurting body lurching around on its own until it finally falls over. Things are even worse for Hector, who, while puking from seeing Jake's headless body, gets his spine and face crushed by the creature. That leaves just Hazard, crazy as ever, and Abel, remorseful and wishing they'd never hunted the creature to begin with. We almost immediately get Hazard versus the creature, and while our insane hunter thinks he's got a shot on him, he's outsmarted by the Gillman using a mirror, suddenly right beside his old enemy and closing in for the kill. The creature's claw grabs Pete's face, and for a beat, they stare into each other's eyes. The creature's expression, hard, intelligent, aware. And now Pete suddenly realizes what he's been hunting all these years, and that he's been outsmarted by an animal. Crunch! The creature squeezes Pete's face, then drives his head into his shoulders. The creature then lifts Pete and throws him to one side, into a shallow pool. Pete's nerves cause his legs to twitch in the water as his blood drips down. Instantly, the water starts churning, turning red, as piranhas devour what remains of Pete's corpse. It only takes them a few seconds, and they move on, leaving the pool peaceful. Only Pete's clothes and rifle lying there. As you can see, there are some extremely brutal, bloody deaths, and as a result, this film obviously would have needed a hard R rating, which would have depicted the monster as being a truly scary and violent version of the creature. That leaves our climax, with Abel finding Siri unconscious in a waterfall-filled cave and about to be crushed by a humongous anaconda. It's a very sudden, completely not set up danger that causes Abel to use all his harpoons and bullets to try to kill the snake. But when he can't stop it from squeezing Siri, the creature arrives, not only knocking out Abel again, but easily ripping apart the 45-foot snake to save Siri. This leads to a moment of understanding between our beauty and beast, as Siri pulls the last harpoon out of the creature, and although it wants to touch her, The creature chooses not to, knowing that it could hurt her, and slowly, sadly returning to the water. With Abel conscious again and the surviving two heroes leaving the grotto, they're watched from afar. At the surface of the water, the creature rises, raising his head so that just his eyes look out at the departing humans. Move into his eyes, staring, and as he slides slowly back down into the water, we fade out. The end. So, about that script. Keep in mind that this is a first draft that was written by Phillips, but I think it is an imbalanced script, although it is a solid start. There's just way too much time spent exploring the pyramid, which I chose not to get into because it would have been really boring, and also I think it would have been prohibitively expensive without a lot of upside to that, because the Gill Man is just missing from most of that. Also, just way too many of these characters get lost in the shuffle. Some of them are clearly there just for a body count, but other characters like Jake and Hector, who are developed in the first half, really get lost in the second until they pop back up to be brutally murdered. And as a character, I just think that Hazard doesn't work at all. He's set up as this really scary and unhinged sort of villain that's hellbent on revenge, but he's way too crazy and unpredictable and too silly to be anything more than just a small complication that eventually gets pushed to the side and then gets brutally killed. I do like the depiction of the creature. He's well done, has a lot of interesting facets to him as a monster, and is effectively portrayed in a sympathetic light. He's more heroic, especially compared to some of the men on board the boat. He is obviously there to protect the land and protect the creatures that are there, which is an interesting addition. It makes him more of a mythological, almost supernatural being, and I really like that approach to the character. Also, he doesn't die at the end of the movie, which is a new one for the creature at this point in time. And I like what they do with his connection with Siri. He clearly has a romantic interest in her, and she comes to understand him a bit more, instead of what you often see with other creature movies, which is a much more one-sided thing. And I like that it makes a sort of complicated version of him, in which he's too dangerous to be around humans and to be in some sort of connection with them, and needs to return to his land, and it makes him more tragic and sad by the end. So I really do appreciate that. The interesting little bits of mythology with the pyramid and the hieroglyphics are hinted at, but I think that there could have been a lot more done with that in this draft. As it is, it's just sort of put there as a possibility and some interesting texture to the story and this world, but it's not enough. Either less of that or way more of that, and then I think it would be more interesting, because as is, it's sort of a half measure. So with all that said, why didn't this film get made? Unfortunately, it's the same story that can be said for a lot of Carpenter's career. Upon its release in 1992, Memoirs of an Invisible Man bombed at the box office, and honestly, it's a pretty bad movie, made worse by Chevy Chase unsurprisingly being a nightmare to work with. And while work on Creature, including Phillips' draft and Baker's creature designs, continued through 1992, Universal got cold feet on Carpenter once again. By the beginning of 1993, the project stalled and then quietly died. Still, that didn't stop Universal from trying to get a remake done, with the studio cycling through Ivan Reitman, Peter Jackson, Guillermo del Toro, and more in the decades since. Most recently, it was announced that James Wan would direct a new creature feature for Universal. Will it get made? It seems like this is the one most likely to happen, but after 70 years of not being able to make another Black Lagoon movie, I'll wait and see, because while the Gill Man is my favorite Universal monster, and Jack Arnold's Creature from the Black Lagoon is one of my favorite horror movies, I just love to have more of these films. A new creature film with a still strong John Carpenter behind the camera would have been a dream come true. But this one will have to stay hidden at the bottom of the Black Lagoon. Thanks for watching today's video, and I didn't want to end the year before I did another Unmade film video. As I mentioned here, a few years ago I did a video covering the many different unmade films of John Carpenter, and that included a brief discussion of his Creature from the Black Lagoon. However, that was just an overview of each of those movies and didn't talk about them in detail. So when I decided that I wanted to talk about another Unmade film, I thought this would be a perfect combination of my interests. Unmade movies, John Carpenter, and The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And in reading the script, I think it's a solid start, but a pretty unbalanced approach. As I mentioned, a lot of the characters fade away from view in the second half. There's just way too much spooky exploring of an underground pyramid that doesn't go anywhere, and a lot of the action and cool moments are shoved into the last 20 minutes or so. I don't mind at all the changes that are made to Black Lagoon here. I think it's all pretty solid and interesting. And it feels like it could stand on its own without needing to wink wink nudge nudge you about all the original Creature movies and what they did with the character. I like the small homages, but it really is just small throughout the script. And like I said, some of those ideas from Carpenter didn't make it into this draft. So it is possible that there were later drafts that were written before this project was cancelled that went more into the Lovecraftian history and the so-called creationist scientists that were funding this expedition. The expedition really doesn't have any explanation here in this script, so that could have really been built out and made a lot more interesting. And then having this creationist team collide with a sort of Lovecraftian, elder god-created monster would be a pretty interesting clash within this film. Still, I did enjoy reading this script, and I hope that you enjoyed going through this story and understanding what it would have been and why it didn't get made. Also, that Rick Baker creature is really cool looking. It's a shame that was never brought to life on screen. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this version of Creature from the Black Lagoon, other unmade scripts you'd like for me to cover in future videos, and other monster movies you'd like for me to talk about. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video, and exclusive reviews voted on by my members and patrons. With December's exclusive review being a discussion of Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, which is a perfect companion to this video. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and enjoying a good monster movie.